Let me start by saying the thing about Marx is it's not that Marx was the first opponent of capitalism. There were lots of people who were critical of capitalism before Marx was around. But if you wanted to pick out a sort of singular contribution that Marx made, and this came out quite well, I think, in the speeches by Trevor and Alex this morning, the most singular idea of Marx is the idea that the emancipation of the working class must be conquered by the working class itself. And this is an idea that doesn't come about through abstract speculation, but it comes about through a whole process in which Marx had to identify and discover the working class struggle. And I wrote in an article recently, Marx's discovery of class struggle is a bit like Christopher Columbus discovering America. There were already people living there. In other words, he identifies with these struggles that are beginning to emerge in the 1840s that drive forward and impel working class people to attack capitalism at its roots. And one of the very famous lines in Marx's Communist Manifesto, which I want to start with, is this idea, which Alex again quoted in the plenary, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, wherever it goes, it creates its own gravediggers. In other words, you have this concept already in the 1848 Communist Manifesto, and quite early in Marx's career, that capitalist globalization is creating a global working class. When people say that Marx's conception of the working class is outdated, we have to start by saying Marx was a great prophet of this process. When Marx was writing in 1848 about the global working class amounted to about 10 million people. A tiny, tiny proportion, 2 or 3% of the global population at that time. Today, if you look around the planet, we have now reached, 5 years ago, according to the International Labour Organization, a world historic tipping point where, for the first time in human history, the majority of those who work are wage labourers, are proletarians in the sense that Marx would identify them, consisting of some 1.6 billion people. And that's a very conservative estimate of the size of the working class. Not only that, but if you look around the world today, increasingly we're talking about a world of urban working class people. There's a recent report that projects that by 2050, something like 60 or 70% of people will live in urban settlements. Already today it's 55%. In other words, we're in a world of a majority urban working class population as Marx would understand them. But really, the really controversial thing about Marx is not that there are a lot of wage labourers. It's the next sentence in the Communist Manifesto, which let me quote it. The bourgeoisie's fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Now that's a proposition that not just on the right wing of politics, but even on the radical left of politics, there is deep, deep scepticism about, including from many people, as Alex said, who would accept large elements of Marx's critique of capitalism. They accept him as someone who provided this amazingly rich description and theoretical approach to capitalism, but this concept of working class self-emancipation, which I would argue is Marx's hardest won theoretical innovation, is precisely the thing that's left out of radical left thought at the moment today. I want to give you some examples, and then what I'm going to spend the most of the meeting doing is trying to demonstrate that Marx's understanding of capitalism is inseparable from this concept of worker self-emancipation. But to give you a couple of examples, fashionable radical left theories, there's a lot you could choose from when discussing these theories. Let me just take a couple of examples. One is the Italian Marxist Antonio Negri, who works with Michael Hart, an American theorist, who between them, starting around 2000, produced a very, very important trilogy of books emerging out of Marxism, but they come from a particular strand of Italian, what's called autonomist or open Marxism, arguing that what has taken place is a recomposition of class so fundamental that the whole logic of class exploitation as Marx understood it is now antiquated. Let me quote them. In a previous era, the proletariat was centred on and was at times effectively subsumed under the industrial working class, whose paradigmatic figure was the male mass factory worker. Today that working class has all but disappeared from view. It has been displaced from its privileged position in a capitalist economy. So here you have a fixation on a particular concept of what the working class is, and the idea that this is pushed into the historical past. And accompanying this, you have this idea that there's no special role for wage labourers under capitalism and the struggle against capitalism. Anyone anywhere in the system is exploited or has their creativity absorbed, and therefore the break with capitalism can take place at any point. There's no special role for the working class organised inside the workplace in this theory. A second strand of opinion, which has become very popular in Britain and America and some areas of Europe since 2011, is the concept which again came up in the plenary this morning of precarity, or as Guy Standing puts it in his book, the precariat. The idea that in the place of the old working class, you have this split into different groups, separate classes, the precariat on the one hand, what he calls the salariat of these privileged professional workers, and so on the other hand. Not sure how you deal with me, I'm a lecturer on a temporary contract, so maybe I'm salariat and precariat, and various other groupings. So the old structures of class have fractured. And again, this is to quote Guy Standing in his book, The Precariat. A society consisting mostly of workers in long-term, stable, fixed hours jobs, with established route of advancement, subject to unionisation and collective agreements, with job titles their fathers and mothers would have understood, facing local employers whose names and features they are familiar with, this has disappeared. Okay, so again, you have this very, very fixed conception of what working class society looked like. And I could add to this Leclau and Mouve, Hobsbawm, André Gortz, Manuel Castells, Slavoj Žižek in the more recent period. Paul Mason wrote a book, Post-Capitalism, that makes these arguments. A whole series of theorists who are beginning to, or have for 20 or 30 years now, been challenging the centrality of class, even though pretty much all of those people come from a Marxist or radical left tradition. And what I'm going to argue is that really, if we want to understand class in the contemporary world, we could do far worse than returning to what I call the classical Marxist theory, which I'm going to argue has nothing really in common with the kind of stereotype that associates workers with a fixed point in the history of capitalism. Now, one of the difficulties when you talk about Marx and class is that Marx, although he emphasised the importance of working class self-emancipation, there isn't a book you can point to by Marx where he describes exactly what he means by class. His plans for Capital included a book on wage labour. For whatever reason, it's subject to intense speculation. He never wrote the book on wage labour. My life would be a lot easier if he had. But he didn't. Louis Althusser, someone I don't quote very often, one of the most repugnant Marxists in my view, but he writes, if you look at Capital, there's a quote, a title, classes, 40 lines and then silence. In other words, the text of Capital breaks off precisely when Marx is starting to discuss the concept of class. So we can't just look at a book and extract this theory. What I want to argue is that you can reconstruct a basic framework for talking about class from Marx's own writings, and that it tells us something useful about the contemporary world. We can't just transplant it to today, but we can creatively apply it to understand something about class today. And the central concept here is a concept of what Marx calls the relations of production. And there's this couplet in Marx where he talks about the forces and relations of production. By forces of production, he means the capacity of society to produce to meet the range of real and artificial human needs, if you like, that develop historically. Machinery is the obvious factor in the forces of production. What does he mean by relations of production? And here already, there's a huge controversy, really, which I want to explore, because often when people talk about relations of production, what they end up talking about are the sort of micro relations that people form inside the workplace. How people interact in the workplace, the precise way in which work is organised, the specific division of labour inside the workplace, and so on. Now, I want to start by saying you can't make sense of Marx's writings if that's your concept of relations of production. The precise way in which you organise the workplace is part of what I would call the forces of production. It's extraordinarily fluid and develops historically. What Marx meant by the relations of production are two much more narrow and specific sets of categories. The first are what I will call relations of exploitation, the specific way in which unpaid labour is pumped out of the people at the bottom of society. And if you look at any class society, whether it's ancient Rome or feudal Europe or capitalism, you'll see a particular technique that's used by the minority at the top of society to pump unpaid labour out of those at the bottom. It helps, in fact, to characterise a society to understand what the mechanism is. And Marx argues under capitalism, the mechanism is unpaid labour through the wage system. It's this wage relationship that is a form taken by exploitation. In other words, workers, when they work, create more value than they take home in the form of the wage. And the gap is what Marx calls surplus value under capitalism. It's a very different dynamic to previous societies. We can talk about that in the discussion. The second example of relations of production are what I call relations of ownership or effective control. So who actually has effective control over the means of production? You can go back to earlier societies and you can identify societies in which the peasantry, for example, would own a large chunk of the means of production. They'd own a plough and an ox and some seed and so on. These are means of production. Under capitalism, characteristically, it's only by way of exception that working class people own and control the means of production. Ownership and control of the means of production rests with a capitalist class, and therefore if working class people are to produce, they have to gain access to these things through a capitalist, through selling their ability to labour. And again, it gives a specific dynamic to how capitalist society develops. The only other thing I'd say about this particular relation of production, it's not collective ownership of the means of production by the capitalist class, it's ownership by individual capitalists. In other words, the capitalists are also, as Alex put it this morning, quoting Marx, a band of hostile brothers. You have this battle of competition taking place over ownership of the means of production at the same time. And it's these two types of relations of production that characterise the capitalist system and exist throughout the history of the capitalist mode of production. And I want to argue it's these particular relations of production that give rise to the special qualities of working class people. And I want to argue it's very important to have this distinction between relations and force of production, because if you think the relations of production are simply the specific ways in which you organise the workplace, the logic of that is every time those relations change, you've got some fundamental transformation of the system going on. The basic laws of motion have been transformed, and that's precisely the conclusion that people like Hart and Negri, Castells and so on and so forth draw in their writings, that the relations of production have been transformed with new technologies and so on and so forth, and this has automatically reconfigured class. I want to argue there's more continuity to class through the history of capitalism. And one consequence of the way that other people look at class is that they tend to fetishise particular stages in the history of the working class itself. In the case of Hart and Negri, who I talked about, their focus is the Italian factory worker of the early 1970s and late 1960s. If you take Guy Standing, he fetishises the post-war arrangements that grew up in the 1950s, Keynesianism, the welfare state that was emerging at the time, the growth of unionisation and so on. In other words, if you take Standing's definition of the working class seriously, the working class has only existed for a couple of decades in a handful of countries. It simply doesn't make sense, if you take Trevor Ngwani as an example, to talk about the working class in Standing's terms, because you've never had that degree of stability, welfare and so on and so forth in many countries. So we have to avoid this fetishisation of particular stages in the history of the working class. Okay, so what are the qualities of the working class flowing from this understanding? I want to argue that there are four key characteristics of the working class that make it, in Marx's term, a special class. The first is that, and this is the obvious one, capitalism's relations of production compel it not simply to create a working class, but to imbue this working class with power by virtue of the special strategic role that workers' labour plays in keeping the system running. You want a prosaic example of this? Look what happens when the tube workers go on strike in London. Society grinds to a halt in London. that there's a strategic role of working class people in keeping society functioning. And this is extraordinarily important if we want to understand arguments like precariousness, precarity and so on. Because alongside this pressure to render workers more contingent, more flexible and so on, you have a counter pressure within capitalism to hold on to workers precisely because the capitalist is dependent on the worker. So we talk about the working class as if we're dependent on the boss. Don't forget the bosses are dependent on us. Because if we withhold our labour or if we disappear, they have to go out and find some other poor blighter to come and work for them. And this means that actually alongside this attempt to make workers precarious, you have a counter pressure in capitalism to hold on to and retain particular forms of labour power. Not just in the really high-paid jobs and so on, but even if you look at horrible firms like McDonald's worry about staff retention. They're not very good at staff retention, but if you look at some of the benchmarks they use, it's have we kept people in stores for 6 months or 9 months? This is how they think about it. Because if they get someone who's any good at customer service who can tolerate working at McDonald's, they're desperate to hold on to them. Yeah? So this idea of mutual interdependence is absolutely central to Marx's ideas. And it's this characteristic that distinguishes exploitation from oppression, which is a key point that, again, Alex was making this morning. There's a distinction. And it contradicts many of the popular theories that see class as one part of a sort of kaleidoscope of different forms of oppression, which is very common if you look at intersectionality theory and so on, that we just have these different forms of oppression that coexist side by side. What Marx is arguing is we should oppose all forms of oppression, but exploitation is a form of oppression that brings with it a form of power. You know, I happen to be mixed race, so I've been subject to racism at various points. I don't acquire any particular power because I'm subject to, I might fight back alongside other black or Asian people, but I don't acquire any particular capacities. Exploitation is different because we can collectively withhold our labour and begin to use it to organise against capital. And this is true, Marx argues, regardless of whether workers are producing manufactured goods, services, and so on. And here, the question of pumping unpaid labour becomes absolutely central. It's not about acquiring particular manufactured goods from workers, it's about squeezing unpaid labour from workers. You know, bus workers or tube workers can also go on strike. People who deliver services can go on strike as well as those involved in manufacturing. Okay. So there's a contemporary relevance to this in a service-based economy. The second feature that Marx talks about is a collectivity of class. The working class is a collective force in society. It's inherently collective. It agglomerates in cities, but it also agglomerates in huge workplaces. Indeed, there is a pressure on capital to take advantages of economies of scale by drawing the working class together in large workplaces. Now, once you've done that, there are contradictory tendencies at work. On the one hand, Marx argues mechanisation of work can reduce the number of workers. If you look at manufacturing, for example, most big manufacturing workplaces have declined in size. They've replaced workers with machinery. Although some of them have still got bigger because they've formed bigger capitalist firms at the same time. Again, it's contradictory. But large manufacturing workplaces tend to decline over time. They tend to have fewer workers involved in them. What happens to those workers is there's a myth which has existed at least since the mid-19th century and probably a little bit earlier than that what capitalism is going to do is it's going to eradicate the working class altogether through automation. The latest phase of this is people like Paul Mason talking about robots and so on. Throughout over 200 years of debate, that hasn't happened. Yes, capitalism periodically creates mass unemployment. That's true, and that's a terrible feature of the system. But ultimately, these groups of workers who are displaced from one occupational area tend to be recruited to work elsewhere. In other words, if you look at, say, Britain currently has record levels of employment despite automation, despite decades, centuries of automation. And what you get as part of this process is the formation of large workplaces in new industries, in the service sector, in the public sector, as these workplaces swell in size. If you look at the US economy, similar data exists for Britain, I'll just quote the US figures. The percentage of employees in workplaces with 100 or more people fell from 1980 to 2007 by just 1%, from 46% of workplaces to 45% of workplaces. In other words, almost half of the US working class are in workplaces of 100 plus people, bigger than the old cotton mills that were the heart of the Chartist rebellion in the 1840s, which typically had about 100, 130 people working in them. So we still live today in a world of collective labour. The third point I want to make about the working class is about working class homogeneity. One of the things that capitalism does as it emerges is it strips away all the uniqueness of different conditions of life, different localities, different national experiences and so on, and it tends to put workers in a more or less homogeneous position. Not a position, by the way, of absolute uniformity. And this is very, very important to say because it's one of the key arguments that's deployed against Marx. Marx doesn't require that all workers are the same. He understands there are divisions and differences inside the workforce, particularly on a global level. The point is that workers can identify a commonality of enemy, a commonality of the kind of tendencies they're subjected to. You notice, I remember the Asian Social Forum I went to years ago in India, where you'd see Western workers from areas like the post office and Royal Mail and so on, meeting with their Indian counterparts. And of course there are massive differences, but there's also this immediate recognition, privatisation, bullying, the kind of things that you're subjected to, trying to get one over on the boss, the techniques of organisation and so on. There's a commonality of interest that workers can identify. Now, of course, difference still exists inside the workforce. In many ways, difference is greater in the British workforce, and I think it's in many ways a good thing. It's great that we have a more multiracial, integrated workplaces in general in Britain than we did 50 years ago, and it's fantastic that women have joined the workforce, albeit in large numbers in part-time work because of inegalitarian gender relations. They're forced to do part-time work. But the fact that women have joined the formal workforce in huge numbers is a source of power inside the working class movement. So you have this very, very diverse working class drawn together in these relatively homogeneous positions. Now, of course, you still have occupational fragmentation. If you look at the British labour force, in some ways the occupational diversity, the range of different jobs that people do, is greater than it was 50 years or 100 years ago. At the same time, there are counter tendencies to this that both fragment work but also make it more similar. Look at the way, I'll come back to this point, the way that working inside a university has become just that little bit more like working in a car plant than 50 years ago. I'm not saying they're the same, but actually there are commonalities in work in terms of the way in which they use Taylorism to squeeze more work out of people, in terms of the way in which automation depends to rely on people having generic sets of computer skills and so on. There's a combination of diversity and uniformity inside the working class, and this is a point we can come back to and talk about. But I would want to argue that there is an objective basis for unity inside the working class, even if it's not always realised. Realising that unity is a political project, but capitalism creates the basis on which we can realise that unity. The fourth point I want to make about capitalism is, and the working class, is that capitalism creates inherently a propensity to struggle. The great American Marxist Hal Draper points this out in his book on Marx's Theory of Revolution. Let me quote him. This is a quote from Hal Draper. "The working class moves towards class struggle insofar as capitalism fails to satisfy its economic and social needs and aspiration, not insofar as it's told about struggle by Marxists." Slightly humbling for those of us who go around telling working class people about struggle. By the way, that doesn't always convince people that their working class need to fight. What really tends to convince them, historically, are the pressures of the capitalist system at work on them. And this logic of exploitation and accumulation are constantly forcing new groups of workers to begin to recognise through struggle their capacity to challenge elements of the capitalist system. But not only that, under capitalism, the form that takes is overwhelmingly a collective form, And it's a form that can begin to break with the logic of capitalism altogether. And it does so, Marx argues, because capitalism closes off individual solutions. If you're a peasant in feudal Europe, you can rise up, seize the land from the landowner, divide it up, and each farm a part of it independently. If you work in Heathrow Airport with 80,000 other workers, you can't take it over, divide it up, and each try and land 180,000 for a jumbo jet on your front lawn. This doesn't work. And so the logic of working class struggles tends to be a collective, democratic form of resistance, which gives rise to communes, to Soviets, to workers' councils, neighbourhood assemblies, and so on, which all reflect in different ways this aspiration for a democratic reorganisation of society from the bottom upwards. That's the very essence of working class revolution from a Marxist perspective. Okay. Final point in the last 5 minutes I want to make. It's about the transformation of the working class. And I said quite a lot of what I want to say, fortunately, in the plenary, and I don't have to repeat that. But I want to argue that what you've seen in the last 200 years is this process of constantly restructuring, reorganising class in a way that can make it quite hard to see the continuities between Marx's day and our own. But it's crucially important in this context that we begin to recognise that what capitalism is doing at the moment, it's creating what I would call new forces of labour. It's creating new working class subjects that begin to identify their role as working class people and begin to fight. And I want to just give you a few examples of that to demonstrate how this process happens. First of all, you have those workers still in manufacturing industry. Far smaller groups of workers today than in countries like America and Britain who are beginning to fight. Kim Moody has a fantastic book out, a recent book looking at this. I recommend it. Actually, all of Kim Moody's books I strongly recommend. But one of the points he makes is that because you have the reduction of numbers inside manufacturing, what you tend to get is what's called just-in-time manufacturing processes, so big networks of production which often expand across whole continents and sometimes beyond that, which run on the basis of not holding large stocks of parts and so on, but run on a just-in-time basis. You make the part and you immediately put it in a motor vehicle or whatever it is. And because of that, these quite small groups of workers hold enormous strategic power. There was a strike at Boeing about 12 or 13 years ago now, where they shut down the entire, as a group of machinists on the East Coast, in Seattle I think it was, and a couple of other sites, they shut down the entire global network of production for Boeing, stretching as far as Japan, in a matter of hours. Extraordinarily powerful groups of workers. Not just in manufacturing, but if you look at logistics. People talk about Amazon as if Amazon is transcending the capitalist economy. No, Amazon is actually giving lots of works to posties, and people who deliver things, and people who move boxes around. And the people who run the depots, the delivery services and so on, acquire enormous strategic power as part of this process. Secondly, if you look at groups who are identified as professionals historically, this goes back to arguments that C. Wright Mills put about the white-collar worker and so on. Very interesting going and rereading C. Wright Mills. What are the key groups that he identifies as white-collar workers? It's somehow set apart from manufacturing. People who work in retail, and people who are teachers, work in education. A couple of other examples he gives. These are all groups that have been deeply proletarianised over the last 30 or 40 years. I don't mean proletarianised in the sense that they're turned into proletarians, by the way. I mean that what distinguished them from proletarians in terms of their lifestyle, their consciousness, their mode of existence, is gradually being stripped away. And this is why many of the most dynamic struggles, really since the 1980s, but increasingly today in countries like Britain, are taking place among these groups of workers. Because what you see in places like universities is actually Taylorism being used inside the workplace to render work more like traditional working class labour has been. Who are the two groups who have fought most dramatically in recent years in Britain? Junior doctors and university academics. And as part of those struggles, you begin to revitalise and rebuild a working class tradition. And not just learning that you have power, but learning how you deploy that power. I'll just give you one little example from the university lecturers' strike. Something that's happened a number of times in trade union struggles in Britain is that there's a division between what we call the rank and file, the people who actually work, and the union officials who run the union. And at a crucial point in our strike, about 5 or 6 days in, the union try and sell a deal. And it's a rubbish deal. And everyone can see it's a rubbish deal. What do workers do? They immediately converge on the union headquarters in London, about 600 of us outside the union headquarters, at something like 7 or 8 hours' notice. They take votes on picket lines up and down the country, 40 plus picket lines, and universally condemn the deal, putting pressure on the bureaucracy and forcing them to pull back and go back into negotiations. And to find an example of that in British labour history, you'd have to go back to the 1960s or maybe the early 1970s. Not since that great rank and file insurgency that came out of the period of 1968 have you seen such a rebellion that so quickly has forced union officials to backtrack. This is an example of workers leapfrogging over more traditional groups of workers and beginning to rediscover their power. But it's not just these groups of workers. You see other examples. You look at someone mentioned the TFI Friday strike that's been taking place. These are highly casualised workers beginning to recognise their capacity to fight and so on. And just finally to round it off, because I don't want to just talk about the Western developed countries, but this process is a global process. If you look at, there's actually quite interesting, I don't agree with all of Emmanuel Ness's stuff, but there's a book, Southern Insurgency, which is quite interesting. He focused on South Africa, India and China. And his argument is that what's happening as these new processes of industrialisation unfold is you're getting drawn into the workplace, often first generation migrant workers. If you look at China, it's largely people coming from the countryside, so internal migration. Often quite inexperienced groups of workers, in conditions in the case of China, and this is being echoed in other countries now, where labour markets are getting tighter and tighter, they can't keep up with the demand for labour, in which workers suddenly discover ability not just to resist what capitalism is doing, but since 2010, workers have begun to go on the offensive, to demand more, to begin to organise. And this in a context in which you can be shot, in which you have official trade unions which are run by the state and so on. Despite all this, you're getting this emergence of independent trade unions, not just in China, but a similar process taking place in India now, similar kind of process that Trevor Ngwane was talking about in South Africa. In other words, capitalism, through this dynamic process of accumulation, is creating new forces of labour, north and south. So when we talk about the working class, let's not start from the low level of organisation, the limitations of working class consciousness as it stands in 2018. Let's talk about the great hope that rests with the working class today. And I want to finish by just quoting something Marx wrote in Holy Family right at the beginning of his revolutionary career in 1843. He says that the question is not what this proletarian or even the whole of the proletariat at the moment considers its aim. The question is what the proletariat is and what, consequent of that being, it will be compelled to do. And it's that possibility that the working class might turn capitalism upside down and genuinely liberate itself and thereby liberate the whole of society that spells hope in this very, in many ways, very dark and troubled time in the history of global capitalism. I'll finish there.